What is feminine consciousness? And why is it so important for us as women to incorporate into our lives, into the way that we view the cycles of our lives and our body? Come take a listen where I share all the ways in which feminine consciousness will change your life. Welcome to your emotional makeover. Things your mother never told you because no one ever told her. I'm your host, Dr. Amanda Hansen. This is where you reimagine womanhood. Let us begin. I am so happy you found your way here. Together, we can change the conversation around womanhood. As a gift for leaving a 5-star written review on Apple or Spotify, or sharing this podcast on your social media, I'd like to gift you with my intimacy guide, where you will learn the art of self-intimacy. All the information is in the show notes. Today, I want to talk about cycles of life for women. And I want to do it through the lens of the work that I do in the world with women. All of my work begins with this baseline of bringing into consciousness so much that has been buried for women. So it's really about unearthing female consciousness. And the reason I find this to be so important as a baseline to beginning the work, and why I want to share it here in episode 5. So ongoing in further episodes, we'll already have this context for unearthing and bringing into consciousness the female or feminine nature, the way of approaching and thinking about so many aspects of life. Because up until this point, for the last several thousand years, we have been operating through patriarchal consciousness. That is a society globally, structurally, religiously, in all ways that has been set up. The rules of the game of life have been set up by men for men, primarily to succeed. Now, I'll talk in further episodes how patriarchy has hurt men as well, for sure. But for the sake of today's episode, I want to differentiate between cycles of life for a woman as it relates through the current patriarchal lens and how we experience it. And then I will contrast that with the matriarchal lens, that feminine consciousness, and how the cycles of a woman's life could be so incredibly different, approached, experienced, and even thought about through a very different lens. Okay, so when we think right now about periods, for example, I'm gonna run through periods and then childbirth and menopause, just to give us a rough context of the major phases of a woman's life. Now, obviously, not all women experience pregnancy and childbirth because of their own choice or because of other reasons in their life that was not possible. But I want to share what that gets to look like. All of those things, periods, childbirth, and menopause, what they look like and the typical thread that is run through them in a patriarchal lens. Then I'll circle back and I will run it through the matriarchal lens and the difference in how I have experienced each of these cycles through a matriarchal lens, through what patriarchy was telling me and the choice I made to diverge and see and experience those cycles through a matriarchal lens. So let's set this up. So if we think about periods in our world and our culture right now, globally even, typically a period is thought of as, first, there's very little information that is known about it. It's something that is often hush-hush. Young girls get their very first period often without even knowing exactly what is happening. There is usually some form of hush-hush around it. Not too much celebration, this beautiful rite of passage. And she's typically just handed a pad and told to go and stick it in her underwear. And then more often than not, the average young girl is left to figure out what's going on, either through talking to her girlfriends about it and now being able to search online about it or on social media. So we still don't have beautiful rites of passage ceremony. We don't have mothers and grandmothers talking to young women about this time of their lives and what their body is actually experiencing. We leave very little discussion on the table because of cultural shame around it. And so here's this young girl, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, bleeding every single month for anywhere from 5 to 7 days, give or take. And she's not even actually sure what is happening to her body. And she's more often than not sure what to do, how to support her body, other than maybe take some Advil. So this is often something that is met with so much shame, with so much embarrassment. It's thought of through the patriarchal lens as inconvenient, as something that is messy. It creates emotional dysregulation. It creates bloating. It creates just inconvenience in general. And often it creates inconvenience around sex. And so through the patriarchal lens, you can see how something that the story around it has been shame, inconvenience, unattractive, not able to do the things I want to do with you. The story we then run in our minds as young women. We anchor into this belief that my body is now shameful, it's inconvenient, it's doing all of these things. It looks disproportionate than what it usually looks like. It feels uncomfortable. My emotions are all over the place. And just to bring some context to this, I have worked with clients who have told me that they participated in religions where they weren't even allowed to enter into the church, into the temple, into the synagogue, into the place of worship while they were bleeding. And this is not just in ancient times, this is in very recent times, because they were considered unclean. They were considered unholy. They were considered unable to speak to God or be in the house of worship. So we have to understand the very deep roots of patriarchy, writing a story that while a woman was bleeding, she was impure, she was unclean, she was not able to come and pray or to receive prayer. But instead, she was told that it was too shameful. We look at the ways in which this affects us, and we look at the ways in which that story, even for girls who are not deeply practicing in any religion, still inherently feel the external shame, the external embarrassment. There is even a period product company that recently, I don't know if it was Playtex or Tampax. I can't remember off the top of my head. You can Google this for yourself, but one of the product lines came up with tampon packaging that is quieter when you tear it open. Now I'm thinking, is there that much shame that we can't even let someone else hear that we are opening the packaging for the tampon? We have to hide that there's even a possibility that while we are using the restroom, we may be opening a tampon for insertion. So we are laden with messages as young women around every corner that this is something we should be embarrassed of. This is something we should keep under wraps or be quiet about. And God forbid you get blood on your pants. That is the ultimate of embarrassment. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and this is just an idea that came up for me many, many years ago and something I've thought a lot about. Somebody asked me, why do you think women mature so far in advance of men when they are in their teens and their early 20s, why is the emotional development for a woman so advanced compared to that of her male counterpart? And I have thought a lot about that, and I can't help but think part of that is because from a very young age, young women don't have the leisure or the freedom to not pay attention, to just kick back and do whatever comes their way. They have to be paying attention to when was the last time I changed my pad or my tampon? How many pads and tampons did I pack in my backpack for this school day? When I get up, let me think of how I can adjust my shirt to make sure if I did bleed through that the whole classroom won't see it. Let me calculate how much time I have between switching classes to make sure I get to that bathroom down that hall around the corner that's far away from my class to make sure I have time to change my pad to then get back to the classroom in time. Where am I at in my cycle? Is this an okay time for me to engage in sexual activity? For I certainly don't want to get pregnant. So I better pay attention to where I am in my cycle. So I don't think women from a very young age, young girls, have the leisure to not mature. Our bodies are depending on us. And here we are having periods, our body doing the work to keep all of the human race existing. The existence of humanity depends on a woman having her period. And yet, we carry so much shame around it. There are endless products that will tell women the ways in which they could make their bodies more convenient. There's all the hacks in the world so that young girls could skip a period. Or if you're going on vacation, all the remedies of apple cider vinegar and the concoctions you can take to delay your period by a couple of days. You can get on birth control and not take your placebo week. You can have an IUD inserted and hopefully over time never bleed again. Because the greatest shame for a woman, her monthly bleed, feeling cursed simply by this incredible act that her body goes through every single month. Let's fast forward. There's a million other ways that we can look at that through the patriarchal lens, but for the sake of time, we will keep moving. Let's look at childbirth. The fact that childbirth, there's going to be an entire episode on this, looking at how childbirth is really turned into so much scandal and so much profiteering off of women. We will have an entire episode on that. And as someone who taught natural childbirth classes for over 10 years, developed an app for it, and also gave birth naturally, I will share my very deep dive on this. So that'll be its own separate episode coming up. But when we think about childbirth, just as it relates to patriarchy, we see that this is something that even women are terrified of. So they give their bodies up to a doctor because they have this inherent belief that it is beyond something that they are capable of handling, that the pain will be overwhelming. They could never possibly withstand it, that they won't know what to do or how to do it. So they're going to just have to lay back and let a doctor do it for them. And we also hear so much in South America and in America as it relates to the United States with women scheduling early C-sections, being convinced by their doctors that if they have that baby just 2 weeks earlier, they will be able to avoid those final deeper stretch marks that they would have to endure on their stomach. Again, we hear the patriarchal thread of shame around what a woman's body goes through to create and make space for life, for human life inside of her. We wouldn't want to show any evidence of that. And often through the patriarchal lens, we see so many women scheduling their C-sections because of this terrible myth that they have heard and picked up and believed that somehow their vaginal canal, their vagina will no longer be intact if they have a baby vaginally, and that it will affect sex. They won't be as tight. Their partner won't experience it the same. This absurd lie that women are now making decisions based on a lens of what happens to their body through the patriarchy and how they can best avoid that, because we would never want to disappoint a partner, even though we will circle back on this in some weeks from now. We know that it is not true, that is not, in fact, what happens. So there's shame in the changing of a woman's body during childbirth. There's even shame in the sounds that come out of her body as she is giving birth. And so often, to avoid that really primal sound making that comes from a woman as she's birthing, we'll just decide to just avoid that altogether, because that would be too embarrassing. And I've been told and convinced that I could never possibly handle it anyways. So we see, again, through the patriarchal lens, the way even childbirth has become this thing to fear, the changes in your body you should be ashamed of. And it's probably best if you just sit back and let someone else take care of it for you. Again, because we've not had the stories passed down any differently from mothers and grandmothers. So now periods and childbirth through the patriarchal lens, two of the experiences of a woman's life, if she experiences pregnancy and childbirth. Now we've got the double whammy of shame. Now let's move into, and there are so many other cycles, but I'm touching on the major ones. Now we move into menopause. Later in a woman's life, she enters perimenopause and then eventually menopause. And this is a time where she is made to feel like she's gone crazy, that she is no longer as efficient. She is no longer as sharp. Her estrogen is dropping, so her body is changing, and she's just really not as interesting or worthy or relevant. And she's definitely not as desirable or sensual or sexy or appealing. It's a time where she just becomes, again, wildly inconvenient. Probably better to just let her step aside. Her time has come to pass. And so these major phases of life for women are shrouded with so much shame, this feeling that we need to apologize for the work that our body is doing. So that is the basis under the patriarchal lens. I want to shift now and serve it to you in a way that gets to be so much more beautiful, with so much more honor and ritual and ceremony. I will come back to sharing on these throughout future episodes, but for the sake of this episode today, I will share with you how I anchored into, I will use my own personal experience of how I related with my period, with pregnancy, childbirth, and also menopause. As of this recording, I am at 3 months of having no period. I am 51 years old. So I think it's safe to say I'm in menopause, whether or not I've moved all the way through. We have 9 months left to see if I go all the way through, or if I still get another period, because you essentially, by definition, have gone through the cycle of menopause after you have had 12 months of no period. So Not to say that there aren't still things that happen after that, but for the bigger, heavier lift of menopause, that is essentially the marker by which it is decided on as to whether or not you have completed menopause or moved through the major part of menopause. So I'm 3 months at this point. So let's look at periods. When we think about a period through the matriarchal lens, as we unearth the feminine consciousness and we start to remember and we bring back really old and ancient ways of communing with our body, let's see how this gets to look differently. And I want us to anchor into that word and think about that word, communing. Words like communing, words like ritual, honor, ceremony, being in awe of. So there was a time in my life where I was looking at my periods, experiencing my periods through the patriarchal lens until several years ago when I decided to shift into how could this be different if I started to merge with having my period, if I started to invite it, if I started to look at it as a beautiful opportunity for more intimacy and understanding of myself. So through that lens, what I started to do, as I had a 28-day cycle, and it was very, very predictable. So as I was counting out my cycle and I saw that I was approaching about 48 hours before my bleed, I would start to prepare my mind, my upcoming days, and the ways in which I would be engaging with bleeding. Now, I understand there is inherent privilege in the fact that I can create my own schedule, that I primarily work from home, but there were still many, many days which I had to work while I was on my period. But when and where I could, I changed things around in my schedule as much as I possibly could. But regardless, the approach of how I greeted my period back when I was in the patriarchal lens of it, it was with gripping the seat, waiting for it to come. So much dread, so much disgust, so much frustration. The bottle of Advil ready to go. And then when I shift into the matriarchal consciousness of meeting with and merging with my periods, I then had my heating pad. I then had my journal and my pen. I then had all of my warm herbal teas and honey. I then had my candles and my beautiful music. I had my coziest of PJs and socks and books on the bedside table. Because then I was getting ready to step into nourishing my body, allowing my body, welcoming my blood. And then a couple of years after that, I decided to go a step further. And now I was in the energy of really enjoying having my period. And so what I decided to do is I decided that I would start to ask my body as it was shedding and bleeding. I asked myself, Amanda, what else needs to be shed? What else do you need to release that no longer serves you as you continue evolving as a woman? So while I was physically in the act of bleeding, I was also emotionally in the act of releasing, shedding, and letting go of ideas, beliefs, limitations that were not going to serve the next version that I was stepping into, because we are constantly in evolution. So meeting my periods through the lens of matriarchal consciousness ended up being such an incredible act of honor for myself as a woman. And it's something that I wished I had done so many years earlier. I would have saved myself so much grief, so much suffering, so much frustration, Because our bodies, when we are cooperating with our bodies, anything we are experiencing, even levels of pain, when we merge with the body and we know that it's all happening for a reason, it creates a completely different experience. When I approached it in that energy, I hardly ever even needed an Advil again, because it wasn't something I had this grip against. It was something I decided to get into the flow of. So I share that for any of you. What is possible if you decide to invite having a period through a completely different experience? And then when we step into childbirth and the idea of stretch marks or the vagina being stretched, I got myself so incredibly educated just weeks in after being pregnant. I got my hands on all kinds of information about natural childbirth because I was already of the belief that this was such a powerful, the most natural state of a woman's life. And I wanted to be in the revelry of it. I wanted to merge with the power of my warrior body. And so through that lens, I got myself into rooms, into meetings of women who were of the very beautiful belief of natural childbirth. I got myself in those rooms, in those spaces, in those places. I even went on after my first child and my first natural childbirth experience. I went on to become a natural childbirth educator. And I was teaching on Sunday evenings for many years because I had so much passion around this. I had so much passion to share this message for women about what their bodies were capable of. And I saw that there were so few places for women to receive this information. So through the lens of deciding there was nothing to fear, this pain was with purpose. There was nothing to fear. My body was made to open and bring this baby into the world. Without resistance and knowing that I could work with my baby to bring my baby into the world. My baby was working with me. My experience was so profoundly holy. Two of the most powerful, life-changing experiences of my entire life because I felt everything. And I didn't go in with the idea that there was something wrong with my body when it felt pain. I understood what the contractions were doing and I understood how to work with them. And so through that feminine consciousness, that remembering that this is what my body was made to do, I was able to be in this unbelievable connection, a connection with myself that I rarely have yet tapped into like that again, because it was so extraordinary. As I come back and talk about childbirth in future episodes, I will share a very detailed account of an experience and a visualization that just downloaded and happened for me during my first childbirth that transcended me outside of that time and that place and really changed the course of how my birth went the next few hours after that. So powerful. But I think all of that was available to me because I was in such openness around this. My mind was open. My body was open. My heart was open. I was in this surrendered experience of letting my body in many ways take over because my body holds a wisdom that is far beyond anything that my mind is ever going to be capable of. That's that buried feminine consciousness. I got out of the way, my rational brain's way, to let my body take over. And it knew exactly what to do. And I didn't steep into this belief that stretch marks meant something to be afraid of. I didn't believe that stretch marks meant damage. I believe they meant honor and power and warrior. So we get to decide, what story do we want to anchor into? And the same was true for understanding. When you understand the mechanics of the vagina, you understand that the vagina being stretched out is a myth. It is not true that that happens to a woman. It's amazing what her body is capable of. And the reality of if she has an external tear, that can be sewn, that can be stitched by a midwife or a doctor. And truth be told, every woman who's had natural childbirth experience and we're not where the baby was pulled out by forceps or vacuum extraction, because that creates vaginal atrophy because you're pulling against and really stressing the muscles and the tissues inside. But when a woman is working with her body and pushing the baby out, there is something incredible that happens for her sexually very soon after and for all her years to come. So for women who have experienced vaginal birth, they, at least in my group of friends, will tell you, and many of us are of a different belief system and how we approach most things, but will tell you that sex only got much, much better after having vaginal childbirth. And vaginal childbirth that you were in control of, let's say that. And I'll come back to that in the future. But the power that lives within that and the beauty and the opportunity and the invitation. And for menopause, I've obviously already been in the perimenopause phase, and now I'm in the menopause phase. And approaching it through a matriarchal lens, I know and trust very deeply that my body is wise beyond anything that I can do to outsmart it. And I understand and welcome in the truth that my body's estrogen level lowering during this time of my life is because it's meant to. It's not something I'm afraid of. It's not something that I have decided is wrong with my body. And I've been in deep ceremony with my body the last several months as it was coming into this phase of menopause. I have been doing the most powerful rituals around what my body is going through and experiencing. And when you commune in that energy, in that way, through that lens, you experience menopause as one of the most powerful, beautiful rites of passage. And I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss it because I'm trying to be 30 or even 40. I want to be in the energy of who I'm becoming as I walk through this threshold. So if I stay in the feminine consciousness, I'm not afraid of this phase of my life. I'm not afraid of the very natural things that are happening. And my sensuality is at its peak. Because rather than being against my body or believing that it's getting too old or it's becoming less worthy, less attractive, less important, because I don't believe any of that, I believe quite the opposite. My sensuality is at a place and a level that far exceeds anything I experienced in my 30s or even early 40s. Because I am in a place of profound wisdom and communion with this stage of my body and the listening to what my body is telling me. So we can see the drastic, very stark differences when we view our body and its cycles through the patriarchy and through the stories men have told and what we have then decided to hold on to as women. And the very beautiful different flow that is possible when we are in the lens of matriarchy and deciding to see through that. Both are available to you. The patriarchy is obviously the very strong machine and narrative that is running, that you're already probably all operating by. I had to work to exit that and create something different. And the work I had to do was bury that feminine consciousness that I knew was in there. I felt it. When I talk about I knew something was supposed to be more beautiful in life, I just knew everything was supposed to be more beautiful. My periods, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause, relationships, everything. I just knew life was supposed to be more beautiful. But for a long time, I didn't know what that beautiful thing was. I didn't know how to access it. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago when I started unearthing this buried feminine conscious within me. It's within every single woman. We've just been so far removed from trusting ourselves as women that we don't know how to access it. And with doing that, and what I help my clients do, and what I do in my community right now, my community on Facebook, this is the conversations we are having on the daily, how we keep bringing more feminine consciousness to our lives. Women's lives just become more and more beautiful every single day. And it's not a life of delusion. It's not a life without pain and heartbreak. It's just through the lens of matriarchy and feminine consciousness, even pain and heartbreak are holy rites of passage, and always information to creating more intimacy within ourselves, getting to know ourselves better. So, and there's going to be an entire episode about pain, and there'll be one about loneliness and about rage, and how we make the most beautiful art out of those big and wild, oftentimes scary emotions. But for the sake of today, I hope that you hear the invitation. And if at any point in this episode you felt the trigger, understand that even feeling triggered is part of the patriarchal storyline. When we don't allow women to show up and share different perspectives and different stories and not keep our hearts open, it's because we have been trained to believe she's wrong. She's blaming, she's shaming. But let's hold on to ourselves and hear the beautiful invitation of what is possible. I'm on the side of women. That's my entire livelihood. My entire reason that I get up and do this work is because I'm so on the side of women. I'm so on the side of their inherent power and beauty and profound wisdom that I can't not share this other way of living and being. And as always, each and every one of us will decide which works best for us, which we are more curious about. I am here for those who are seeking something more beautiful for themselves, that have that inkling, that feeling that maybe there's just possibly another way. This message is for you. I see you. I was you. And now I'm wildly free. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I would love to hear your feedback. Message me on Instagram or write a review. And of course, if you know a woman who could benefit from this episode, please share it with her, because it can heal her life. And that's what sisters do. Love always, Dr. Amanda.